Hi, Frank. How are you? It's been a long time.
It sure has, Ted. So nice for you to do this. I really, really appreciate this. I've actually been looking forward to this episode for a while. It coincides with my weekend where I start, because WBBG was my very first professional gig, and I started there April 1st of 1982. So, 41 years.
That was in the music of your life years, wasn't it?
That was the music of your life years.
Yeah, okay.
So what I do is, I don't know how familiar you are with what I've been doing. This is strictly a hobby. I'm having fun with it. It's a way to kind of connect myself to my dad and have a little bit of fun with it. I kind of miss some of the things about radio, but not everything. And so I take an album a week. I play anywhere between 6 and 8 songs. I talk about the music itself. I talk about the artist. I talk about any kind of connection to radio or my family. So coming up was Harry Hershey and the WBBG Orchestra Big Band Grandstand album.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm going to completely break the format of what I do, and I'm really going to tell some fun stories about my time at the very first radio station that I worked for, talk about some of the great people we worked with, and then I said, you know what? I need to talk to Ted as well, just to make it really authentic, and I'm so glad that you were able to do this.
Well, who are some of the people that you've gotten so far?
Nobody, because everybody I'm going to be talking about isn't around anymore.
I hope that's not some kind of a...
No.
I'm searching for the word.
Right, exactly. So, so I thought, what a great opportunity. Quick question: the morning guy, was it Tom Armstrong or Jack Armstrong?
It was Tom Armstrong.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, Tom worked.
Jack.
Tom worked for years at WGAR. My mom and dad listened to him a lot. And when I started at WGAR, he was still there. It was sort of like, this 22-year-old kid is now working with the guys that your mom and your grandpa listen to.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that's exactly what happened when I walked back the first day of my internship. I was, quote, writing news for Bill Randall. I was ripping news for Bill Randall. But when I walked in the door that first time, and I'm still living with my parents, I was a 19-year-old kid, and I said, "Oh yeah, I'm writing news for this guy by the name of Bill Randall," and my dad was like so excited because he grew up listening to Bill Randall. And was very, very excited. So kind of the same feeling. So, we're going to get to WBBG in a minute, but I did want to talk a little bit about, you've had a really interesting career as well. So how far down the line was WBBG? Where were you before WBBG?
Probably a dozen other places. I've always loved radio, and I can remember in years before I could walk, I was fascinated by that box that sound came out of. When I would get back in grade school yet, whenever a radio station was holding a remote broadcast near where I lived in South Euclid at the time, I'd ride my bike over there. And one of the places that I went to visit was when WJW was doing a remote just down the street. And Casey Kasem was there, so I met Casey Kasem over there. Interesting story about that, because there was one night Casey had premiered a record, and I happened to be doing an air shift on 850 a number of years later, and I played that record, and I said, I remember the first time I heard this was when Casey Kasem played it on this very station. And I got a call from Casey's lawyer, who said, "What a great remembrance it is," Avery Friedman. And he told Casey, and Casey sent me a personal thank you letter for it, which was kind of an interesting thing from when I was just a few years old then on. And then I did as much hanging around the radio stations that would let me in. In high school, I lived right around the corner from Jay Miltner, who was a personality on WTAM back in the 50s. And at that time, it was on KYW, and Jay was a ham radio operator, and so was I. And I went to school with his son, Chris. And several times I would ride down to KYW with Jay, and I'd sit around the TV station and talk to people there, and then I'd walk upstairs into the radio station at KYW, which at the time was my favorite station, and had a chance to meet all the personalities up at KYW. And then I got my first job, actually a paying job, was at the little WELW out there in Willoughby.
Oh, yeah, familiar, yep.
And then and rode with that for like 4 or 5 years. In the meanwhile, while I was at WELW, I was also doing announcing work, the booth work at the old Channel 61 when it was WKBF. And I got a call from the program director at WGAR saying, would you like to do weekends? And so here's this 22-year-old kid working at the great big WGAR before it was the big 1220 days. And so I worked weekends there, and a guy named Chick Watkins, who later turned out to be the program director, replaced me, and then he left, and then I replaced him, and then I left again, and he replaced me, and then he kind of rode with it, became production director and then program director, and then kind of like the big guru of music of your life for a while. In the meanwhile, I went with the 107.9 FM when it became WELW FM. Because, it had a huge signal, and we thought we were going to make some waves with it, going top 40 with it. Well, it was just a couple of years too early for top 40 on FM. So when that quit, when that left, a guy down in Youngstown hired me to do mornings on WFMJ radio. And I worked there for about a year and a half and came back to Cleveland to put the AM 1000 WSUM on the air. And that lasted about a year. It failed. So then I managed to latch on to the afternoon drive shift down at WAKR at Akron. And after that, after the general manager left there, they, for some reason or other, didn't like me there anymore, so they fired me. And on the way home, I got a job at WCUE there in Akron and worked there for a month or two. And then I got a call from 3WE saying, come on up here, and we're going to discuss your new job. And so I was at 3WE, so I was in the big time from then on. And let's see, so that was...
About what year was that? I was just going to ask you.
That was 75. And then after that, I got a call from a guy down in Dayton. And this was the biggest mistake in my career. He says, come on down, work for us at WHIO, which was the big station in Dayton. So I picked up and moved down there, and after several months down there, after only about 4 or 5 months, I knew that this just wasn't going to work, and they weren't keeping their promises and so on. So I called the guys up at 3WE, and I said, hey, do you mind if I come back? So they brought me back as chief engineer. At that time, they were selling 3WE, and they were buying, what was it? I think it was the 1260 they were buying at the time. And they said, come back up here, and we want you to be the chief engineer of M105 and also do an air shift on WBBG and be their chief engineer. So I did that, and that they started off with Super Talk, and so I did an air shift there for a while. And then they changed it to Solid Gold Oldies, and that kind of worked, but not as well as they wanted it to. So then they took it to Music of Your Life. And this is kind of where you come in then. They took it to Music of Your Life they had it Music of Your Life for about a year and a half. And I'm trying to remember the timeline on this now, if it was still Oldies or Music of Your Life when they brought in Enterprise Sports Network, the upstart, which was eventually going to turn into ESPN. But they started carrying that at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. And then they switched to All Music of Your Life. Larry Robinson bought the place, which you would have encountered them. Larry Robinson.
Right. I was there during the transition between the Ambrosias and Larry Robinson. Yes.
Yes. And then come 1985, it was time to move on from there. So I talked to Dave Popovich, who was just putting this new station on 850 called WRMR. And it was sort of like what they call Format 41, which was supposedly to appeal to a 41-year-old with kind of an AC type of format. And that lasted for 2 years for me. And they didn't renew my contract over there, so I literally walked across the street, and Mike McVeigh helped me get in to do middays at G98, which was, by that time, WNCX. They had just changed over to WNCX. And that I knew was going to be short-lived because I knew I was going to be going to WDOK after that, but I needed a job for a while. So then in late 1987, I went over to DOK and also took over as chief engineer of 3WE. And then they sold off 3WE and picked up the 850 frequency about 1990. And I stayed on middays at DOK and also the chief engineer, and did an occasional fill-in on the 850 when it was WRMR. And did that till about the mid-90s. And then Sue Wilson wanted to make a change on DOK and bring in a guy named Rob Schuler. And so I started doing some weekends on DOK. But then after that, let's see, I'm trying to get my timeline straight here. Let's see, that was DOK. And then after that, I just they gave me an air shift for a while for actually it only lasted a month on WRMR, because when that station was sold, the people there said, "Oh, we can't have our chief engineer on the air." And I'm thinking, why not? Something goes off in my ear.
And you've been doing it for how many years by that time?
Yeah. In fact, I helped bring it to 50,000 watts. That was my big technical project of taking it from 10,000 to 50,000 watts. And so I left there, and of all places, the guys out at WELW made me an offer and not only matched my salary from WDOK, but also said they'd pay for my health insurance. And I said, let's take a shot at this. So I did that for about 4 years. They got real cheap after that. So I said, I can't do this anymore. So then I called Bob Conrad up at WCLV, and he gave me the morning show on the AM when WRMR became 1420. And then also did engineering work as well. I was kind of like a double threat for him because I had the AM experience with directional radio stations. And so I spent half the day on the air and the other half of the day doing engineering work for him. And a little bit of production here and there. And then when he sold that station, to tell you what a gentleman Bob Conrad was, he didn't fire me. He says, "Ted, I can't keep you on at full time, but I'll keep you on at half salary at half hours. Just to do engineering with me." And so I hung with that, and then I called up the people over at Metro Traffic and said, "Hey, I need a part-time job for a little while here." So I was doing mornings at Metro Traffic, and after the for early drive time mornings, and then would go over to WCLV at about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and then I couldn't. I just didn't want to do this the 2 hours. 2 or 3 hours here, 2 or 3 hours there. So I talked to Frank Foti and Denny Sanders and Jim Steve Church at Telos, and I went over there as a technical support person for almost 10 years. And then I retired out of there about 6 or 7 or 8 years ago now, something like that. All during the meanwhile, I was doing booth work in the 80s for the old Channel 61. And for 32 years, after Jack Reynolds left doing the voiceover work at Channel 43, I did that until they basically, the only reason I left there is because they shut down the UAB productions. And
that's actually one of the things I wanted to touch on in your career is not only were you heard in the local airwaves, but your voice was actually heard all across the country because of the tag work you did during those years.
Oh, yeah.
Correct?
Exactly. I mean, from New York to Los Angeles to Chicago to Miami, all the major markets that carried these PI-type commercials. Hawaii, a friend of mine was visiting in Hawaii and said, "I heard you out in Hawaii. I can't get away from you. I heard you down in Mexico. I can't get away from you." And and I guess it also, a couple of the things also ran over in Britain, Great Britain too. So that's what they tell me. And about a year after I retired from Telos, they called me back and said, would you like to do a little freelance work for us? And I said, well, yeah, let's talk about it. So since I'm also an audio person, very much involved in audio processing, they said, well, we would like you to do some work on some of our new products, the Omnia Volt, the Omnia 7, and the Omnia 9, as well as continue to develop some presets and stuff for the Omnia 11, which I guess they're still using in their factory presets. And I did that and then they paid me and also bought me a new computer, which I'm using right now. Then after that, about a year ago, the guy that was kind of happy to see me go, he said, "You're getting too old." He didn't say it that way, otherwise I could have sued him. But yeah, he was kind of the guy that was encouraging me. Why don't you retire? Why don't you retire? He called me back and said, we're really short on people, and we know how good you were at tech support. And I said, well, why did you tell me to retire then? I would have stayed there for a while. Well, are you interested? I said, yeah. What's it consist of? He says, well, it's just basically working out of your house, taking customer support calls. And I said, yeah. And he says, what's your rate? And I said, my starting rate is $75 an hour since I'm working from home. And I never heard from him after that. So that leads me up to today. And then about a little over 4 years ago, I got a call from Clarence Buccaro, who I happened to do some work for when he was at the Painesville station out in the mid-'80s.
And I was at the station when you were doing that work there. So I know Clarence very well. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So Clarence called me up and says,
through 88, yeah.
Yeah. So Clarence called and said, you want to put an oldies station on the air? I says, we've been thinking about doing an oldies format on one of the 6 stations. And I said, let's talk. So we came to an agreement, and for 4 years now, I've been programming the oldies station. And then about a year and a half ago, Jim Ambrescia and I talked, and he said, would you like to create a light mix or a light rock format on to kind of soften up a little bit and make it a little more broad appeal on 97.1 WREO FM in Ashtabula. And I said, well, let's see what we can come up with. So we came up with an agreement, and to this day now, and I'm going to be 77 this year. You talk about an old coot in the business. Ooh. If I ever bought a radio station out west, I'd get the call sign KOOT with music for old coots. And so that's what I've been doing for the last year and a half up to this very moment. Fantastic. So that's a synopsis of stuff.
That's a synopsis. I know that
in the meanwhile,
one of the things that you didn't mention was you actually had an internet show yourself called 10,000 Oldies. Is that what it was?
Yes. There was when I was working in Telos, I talked to people all over the world, and there was this group out in Seattle that was interested in having me on. They had a little FM station out there, which was a rim shot into Seattle. Actually covered Seattle fairly well. And they said, you want to put together a show? And I did. I said, sure. And they loved it. And the only reason that quit is because the station was sold, and they took it to internet only for a while, and that kind of floundered. And no, I never got paid for anything out there. They promised stuff, and I said. But the thing is, every show that I did out there, I saved, and I made sure it wasn't dated in any way. And that's the 10,000 Oldies show that runs on WQGR at noon on weekdays now. Same thing.
Gotcha. We're going to go back to WBBG here in a minute, but there were quite a few things that you talked about. Number one, when you were at WNCX, I was one of your regular listeners. I don't remember exactly where I was in the car at the time. I might have still been in radio. It might have been in between stations at the time. Who knows? But I absolutely remember listening to you there. Frank Foti was when I made Eagle Scout back in the late 1970s, and I was allowed to pick somebody to shadow for the day. I told the people I wanted radio. Frank Foti was I shadowed him for a day at WELW in Willoughby, And then years later, when I was at Rocket 101 out in Erie, he shows up in the studio because Rick Rambaldo had hired him for something.
Yeah.
So it's just all these things, the way they go like this, it's fantastic.
It's almost like an incestuous business. Everybody works with everybody at one time or another, it seems. And you couldn't pick a better mentor than Frank Foti. Frank and Steve Church, his partner. Actually, when I was at WNCX, I took over as chief engineer there for NCX and WERE. And the guy that I replaced out there was Steve Church.
Yep, exactly. And, another quick example, as we get back to WBBG, is when I took over the overnight air shift at WBBG, that was Dave Sharp's shift. And then when I went to afternoon drive at Rocket 101 in Erie, that was Dave Sharp's shift.
Yeah, there was an exchange of personalities between Cleveland and Erie, and some people even at Ashtabula at the time and stuff like that. Yeah,
I did my time on Sunday mornings at WFUN, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Let's talk real specifically though about WBBG, since we are playing the WBBG orchestra at this point. What are some of your fondest memories about that radio station specifically?
Well, it was interesting because as the chief engineer, it was kind of pulling together the remnants of the old Wixie and working in the old Wixie studio at first before we rebuilt that and the M105 studio that was there. They were doing talk when they first started off, and they had quite a lineup there. They had Bill Gordon and Bill Randall, Ed Fisher, Merle Paulus, Bruce Drennan. They're the guys that brought Bruce Drennan to town. And they did, talk, and then the afternoon sports talk when it was called Super Talk 1260. And that wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. The signal wasn't really that great, but it covered the city. So they said, why not on a Saturday night? Why don't you try doing a solid gold show, an oldies show on Saturday nights? And so we called it the Saturday Night Bandstand, and after American Bandstand at the time. And apparently it was very, very well listened to for a station that was, totally out of the format during the rest of the week. So that's when they decided, they made up their mind to take the station to an oldies format. But then they brought in Eric Stevens, who, was the old music director at Wixie, and he thought it was Wixie all over again. And they put me on the all-night show for about 6 months, and I'm thinking, I'm wasting away at this. This is ridiculous. And so I was looking around a little bit, but then Eric left, and then, because they had Jay Lawrence in there in the morning and King Kirby in the afternoons. And so what happened was, and there was some guy in the middays. I think his name was Bill Brophy, and he wasn't really doing what they wanted him to do. And when Dick Frazier, who had gotten fired from 3WE, came over to work for the Impressions at WBBG, they made him program director, and Frazier put me back on in middays. So I ran with the middays for a while. Then Jay Lawrence quit, and they put me onto the mornings there. And I did mornings for quite a while. Until they changed to Music of Your Life. And it was kind of neat working with Music of Your Life with Chris Columbia. You remember the late Chris Columbia was a super talented guy. He did news, and he did his jazz show on Sunday evenings. And some of the guys left over from DOK just worked there for a little while, but it was Walt Henrik and Bob Engel who had some of the best voices in the business. They were on radio in this town for decades. And so they changed it over to Music of Your Life, and then Larry Robinson bought it, and he came in and he decided he was going to be like the program director, and he chopped up all the tapes that he was playing. Basically, he made it a jukebox for himself. Larry was quite a character. There was one time, you know how AM radio is subject to static during a thunderstorm, but FM usually, is not. Well, being the chief engineer, one morning about 2 o'clock, we had this big thunderstorm rolling through the city. And I get a call 2 a.m. Alexander, Robinson, there's all kinds of static on the signal. And I said, yeah, it's the thunderstorm. He says, well, I don't hear it on the FM. Fix it. And then he hung up. And I thought, for a guy who's worth millions and millions of dollars, he was he was a very strange cat.
I will give you another perfect example of how he treated that station as kind of his own playground. When I was there, it was a weeknight. I get this phone call, and I know it's an early car phone because you could hear it winding up as he's accelerating.
Yep.
And he says, I'm coming in. I want to do a news report. It was like 1:00 in the morning. I want to do a news report. Have a newscast ready for me. So I had to run into the newsroom, grab a bunch of news stories for him, have it there, and he walked in. I flipped open the mic. He sat down. He did a newscast. He was done. He walked out. I rarely ever saw him again.
I'd never heard that story. That's a new one for me. Wow. Well, there's a story about Larry Robinson in the news. John Webster was doing morning news there for a while, and so I was doing like 6 to 10. And Webster was the morning newsman. And so Webster's like 7:30 in the morning, 7:30, something like that. And Webster's in the middle of the newscast, doing kind of a laid-back newscast, for the format. Cleveland police this morning had and then all of a sudden I hear him go, "Whoa!" just like that, and loud on the air. And what had happened was Larry Robinson came in his black trench coat and black hat, kind of pulled low on his head, and just stood behind Webster. Webster felt like a presence there, and he turned around and scared the bejeepers out of him. So, and he said, Larry, he says, our owner just walked in and scared me. I think Robinson got a charge out of that. One time when I think it was Ronnie Barrett that was on the air, was playing something off a disc, off an LP. And Larry Robinson walked in and said, I don't ever want to hear that record on this station again. So right in the middle of the record, Ronnie reached over, lifted up the arm on the stylus, and he said to the audience, ladies and gentlemen, our owner doesn't want to hear that record anymore. And Robinson seemed to get some kind of a charge out of that.
Actually, Ronnie told me that story. I remember him telling me that story, yes.
Yeah, and that was one of the things.
So there was a time. Go ahead.
Oh, and some of the stuff just before you got to the station, Bruce Drennan would do some morning sports reports that he would call in first thing in the morning, and they'd cart them up. They were like 3 minutes long. So the guy that was doing the recording of it picked up like about a 5.5 minute cart, and Drennan would go on about 30 seconds later, and on one of the reports, what would happen? He'd say, let's do this again. So the guy recording the cart would stop the cart and then start it again, and Bruce would start. He said, just make sure you recue it to the point where, it's the full report. So I'm sitting in the studio, Jay Lawrence and I are in there, and we're playing we're kind of only half paying attention to what Drennan is saying. So we're listening to the sports report, and Bruce is going on and on and on. All of a sudden he says, shit, let's start this thing over again. And then it was dead quiet. And Jay Lawrence and I looked at each other saying, did that really just go out on the air? And so that was one of the Drennan things with Jay Lawrence.
Great story. One of the other people we haven't mentioned in all of this is Carl Reese, who was on the air after Bill Randall, and he would hand it off to me at midnight. So he and I got pretty close. Another great person to look up to.
Oh yeah. Carl and I became quite good friends, and I worked with him also over at WCLV. And in fact, he was the last person on the old WCLV before it went over to Salem. And then they changed the call letters back to, they did the call letter swaps all over the place. So they got the WHK calls back over there. But Carl was one of the nicest, most cordial people you could ever meet. I remember one time, when I was working down in Dayton, I'd known Carl. I'd ran into him a number of times up here. And I was really kind of down and out. And I said, I just got to get out of here. And he talked to me one day and for about a half an hour before he went on the air. And he cheered me up real well. And when I got back, from Cleveland, we started working together again. Because I used to listen to him all the time on WJW. And I can't say enough about Carl as one of the finest people I know. Very handsome man, one of the great voices in radio and all.
Yes. And that's one of the things that we're going to close up here a little bit very shortly. But that was one of the things I remembered. Here I was, a young buck, still in broadcasting school, and every single one of you were so kind to me and offered me all sorts of advice, which didn't and doesn't always happen in the radio business, which could be such a backstabbing business.
Well, there was an interesting time with Bill Randall, Bill and his ego.
Well, that's true. One day, I get it.
One day, when it was over at WRMR when we were on 850, he was having some kind of just getting angry, and his ego was coming in, and he's kind of like cursing around and everything like that. And I just had enough of it. And I said, well, this is either going to get me fired or I'm going to get punched in the mouth or something. But I walked in and I looked at Bill and I said, Bill, why the hell do you act this way? What is it? And he started glaring at me. And then he stopped glaring at me and he started to smile. And he says, well, that's just the way I am. And from that point on, we were very cordial to each other. You stood up to him. You stood up to him and realized you're not going to take his crap. And that was it. And then at the very end, I was the only one he wanted to have fill in for him when he was, approaching the end of his life there at WCLV.
Wow.
So and here's this kid that grew up listening to him. Now he gets to announce Bill Randall's death on the air. That was of all the stuff I ever did on the air, that was the toughest. I just about lost it that day.
Yeah, that had to be tough because he meant so much to so many people.
Oh yeah, yeah,
and including my dad, who this show is all about his record collection, and this is why I was so happy that when I walked in that I could give his life a little. Oh, this is great. My son's working for this Bill Randall. So, but once again, everybody at WBBG was really nice to me and very supportive, and it was the basis of what I did for 16 years before I decided I needed to pay the bills and I got into public relations.
Well, you also have to include some of the guys that were behind the scenes. Tom and Jim Imbrescia and Joe Restefo were three great gentlemen. They were always good to me. Tom ran a tight ship, and he accounted for every penny that was in there. Jim, headed up the sales department, and they brought in that business. And Joe Restefo was the program director, who later went on to become the national setup man for Music of Your Life later on. And, those three guys were superb. Some of the newsmen that were over there that got their start. One of the guys that's gone and taken his career that I had hired was Tom Ciula. And, Tom has done, a lot of stuff freelance and such. Tom is a super person.
Wasn't he also the production director at the time?
He might have been production director, but he did a lot of production there. Behind the scenes also in those days with M105 when they were still together with BBG was Chuck Collins, the late Chuck Collins.
Yes.
And Chuck was a superb talent. Another one, Joanne de Pompey, who is now Joanne Larson, their married name. Joanne started there, and then when there was an opening over at Channel 43, she went over there for decades. And, she was one of the people that really got rolling with M105 there in the WBBG building. Had a chance to interview some incredible people over there, too. I remember one day I walked in to the men's room and, doing a business there, and a guy next to me, I said, doggone, that guy looks like Gordon Lightfoot. So, we finished our business, walked into the production studio, and the guys in the production studio said, hey, Ted, meet Gordon Lightfoot. And we both kind of laughed and said, well, we kind of met already. I had introed Gordon several times over the years. There was one particular time that I was the MC down at Nautica. And as Gordon was singing the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ore boat was going right behind there on Collision Bend down by, Nautica. And it sounded its horn right in the middle of the Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald song. A year or two later after that, knowing the right people, and I was able to get front row center tickets for one of his shows, one of his concerts down at one of the downtown theaters. I think it was State Theater or something or other. And before the show, I went over and I talked to one of the guys on the stage, said, is there any chance I could just go up and meet Gordon? And he says, I'll ask. And Gordon says, yeah, come on up. We'll talk. And so I went in there in about 20 minutes. For about 20 minutes, Gordon and I talked. And he says, Ted, I got to go now. We got a show to do. But after the show, come back up to the dressing room. I want to talk to you some more. And, you know, you talk about a gentleman, one of the most creative forces in world music today is Gordon Lightfoot, and was just a super, super gentleman. And then other people you meet along the way, some of the other artists, some of the old rock and roll artists, and some of the old I'm on the air on 3WE one day. Bobby Vinton walks in. Several of the other artists were there. We're at WBBG one day, and the secretary who was from Jamaica. She wasn't, she was relatively recent transportee up to Cleveland, and she says, "There's somebody here named Uncle Milty. Do you know who that is?" And I said, "Yeah, it's Milton Berle." And so. And I had a chance to interview Milton Berle one-on-one, and one of the easiest interviews I ever did. He literally interviewed himself. He was superb to talk to, one of the best. And then also because of WBBG, they said, "Would you like to meet Tony Bennett?" And I said, "Oh yeah." And so they set me up. He was appearing at when the Front Row Theater was still on there. He was in a hotel right down the street from the Front Row Theater. So I walked into there, and he walked out in his bathrobe, and we talked for about 20 minutes. Tony Bennett.
Wow.
And it just some of the other people that I met were down there, and I happen to know the person who did some of the booking acts at the Front Row Theater. I had interviewed Tony Butala in the Letterman one time, and they actually called me up on stage at the Front Row Theater and introduced me to the audience, the Letterman. That was cool. We got to know just so many people that the entertainers along the way, that weren't even associated with BBG that I have stories about too. The day I ran into Jimi Hendrix, when I say ran into, I mean it. Back in the 1960s, they had these great record parties, and I was coming around to Blind Corner. I can't remember if it was Leo's Casino or Swingos of the Statler or something or other, Swingos Keg and Quarter. And I'm coming around one corner, he's coming around the other corner. We just collide head on. And I said, Jimmy, I'm sorry. He says, "That's okay, man. That's okay."
I can just hear it. Hear it. Ted, I could talk to you for a long time reminiscing, but I think my recording limit is probably getting close to on this app. So I'm going to have to close this up. But you have given me so much good stuff to work with, not only about WBBG, but about the kind of travels that a typical person in radio did, especially back then in, what was, especially Cleveland's heyday, when the AM, was starting to fade out and FM was coming in. But like you said, there was still a lot of excitement around. There was still a lot of big name stars just dropping by the studio to visit. Must have been a fun time.
And just to kind of put the final exclamation point on this, I was the chief engineer for a number of stations around the city, like M105 and WTAM and a couple of the others. As it turns out, my son has taken over as chief engineer of the Cleveland cluster of iHeartRadio, and he's keeping some of the very same stations on the air that I did 30 and 40 some years ago. That's
crazy.
And
that is crazy.
So it's like there's another Ted Alexander out there who's an engineer.
and I bet he is working with a lot of the same people you did along the way as well.
Not that much anymore, because really? the various personalities have they've moved on, and heck, a lot of them are deceased now. Frank, what the heck?
Right.
The only one left of the original KYW is Jay Lawrence. I think Kirby's still around from Wixie, but half the Wixie guys are now dead. Larry Morrow's in his like 83 years old right now. I did a Beastland Ballroom thing with him a year ago, and let's see, and some of the other great people around the market. I worked with Ed Fisher over there when he came home to BBG after his years at WJW. Carl. And Bill Gordon was another guy at WBBG, which was superb to work with. Let's see, I'm trying to think of who else. Merle Paulus, we became good friends, too, for a while.
All
he's
familiar names. Yep.
Now. Yeah. I'm trying to think of who else at BBG that can you think of anybody else that we haven't mentioned yet?
Not really. The only person that I also worked with who wasn't really regular, he had that Sunday night special, and that was Paul Wilcox. So
I never worked with Paul. I met him a couple of times along the way, but never worked with him.
Another great person. He would come in, he'd put the albums down, he would let me play them, he would sit on the other side of the board and just chat. Quick story about him. One day I was on the phone to a friend of mine in Texas who I wanted to visit, but I was telling my friend that I didn't think I could go down there because my tires weren't good to make that long of a trip, and I really couldn't afford to get new tires. As soon as I hung up, Paul handed me his card. He said, He said, you go to this tire store. It was about 2 blocks from the station. You go there tomorrow. You hand them this card. You tell them what you need. I went there. 15 minutes later, I had 4 new tires on my car and didn't have to pay a cent.
Wow, never heard that one. There are some really great people.
Yeah, really. And then I ran into him several years later at the Ohio State Fair. I happened to be down there covering it for WBBG. WBKC. So ran into him then. So again, another nice person in my very first station, my very first experience in radio. So, and I want to thank you for being part of that, and I want to thank you for being part of Spinning My Dad's Vinyl. This was a treat, and I hope my audience enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.
Well, I enjoyed it thoroughly too, Frank. More power to you, if we could measure it in kilowatts or something or other. And if you ever need something, you got my phone number. I'm here. As long as the good Lord lets me still breathe, I'll be here.